Okay, so one of the things about this course is that I'd like you to understand the reasoning behind why we need to get our joints moving and how that affects our muscles. So basically, if you look at my cursor, if we look at the little muscle, the joints in this little drawing, the muscles would actually attach in the ankle, let's say, and they would come up here and then they would attach at the other side of the knee, above the knee. Okay, so muscles will, and some of them will start further down, but usually, and possibly if they start further down, they're attached to the bone rather than a joint. But all muscles are going to come over joints, okay, and through joints. And for the muscles to stretch, so if this was a muscle, for a muscle to stretch, it means two joints will be moving the muscle apart. Oh, that broke. Moving the muscle apart, and then the muscles move closer together. Within that, we have muscle fibers, and muscle fibers usually would glide nicely like this, but when we've got an injury or trigger point restrictions, the muscles can become like this. That's a whole other thing we can look at self-massage for. However, for this to happen, we need the joints to fully move. Yeah, imagine I've got a muscle between me, to fully move, to compress or release the muscle fibers. And the muscle fibers will not do that if the joints are not moving correctly. Now the joints, if we look here, this is a foot, and the joints here, for example, in this foot, let's say this is first met, this joint should be able to go backwards and forwards, so that would be part of plantar flexing and dorsiflexing. And as you can see, there's so many different joints here, and it needs to be able to rotate round, and that would help with eversion and inversion. And it also needs to be able to go from side to side. Okay, and if I've got a muscle that's attached, or fascia that's attached to all of this, then obviously every time I do that, it's going to move the fascia, yeah, and move the muscle fibers. So if I look at something like the foot, where we've just got so many joints, the moment that movement isn't happening, okay, then the muscles and the fascia can't move correctly. So we're looking at how to put good movement back into the foot and back into all of the muscles coming down. So here we would have the fibula and the tibia, and muscles coming down, the tendons coming through here, and all of this movement and all the fascia wrapping around the muscles, okay? So that's why it's so important, because if you look at this, if you imagine we've got muscles and tendons and fascia coming through here, then if the more movement we have, the more it all gets beautifully extended and contracted. But what very often happens when we've got a problem, especially in something like the foot just walks along like this, and maybe the only movement we actually have is a little bit of plantar flexing and dorsiflexing, and we don't have any of the supination. So supination, when we've got all these little joints, I don't know if you can see, but all of these little joints would be moving, and the fascia would be moving, and the tendons and everything with the movement of the foot. But what happens is when we've got restricted movement, very often in the hip or further up the body, we end up and we just kind of go along and bash our foot on the ground, and we don't have any of this movement. So we're not stretching, releasing, mobilizing the muscles and the fascia of the body. So that's why we're looking at mobilizing the body as much as possible, not just in the foot, but because further up the body, what's happening in those joints will affect. Again, if you look at my drawing here, it will affect if you've got movement restriction in the hip, it affects the muscle coming down, attaching over the knee, which affects the muscle and the fascia coming down into the foot. So why do I need to fully move my joints? Because muscles, joints act and muscles react to joints. The less movement in joints that you have, or restricted movement in different ranges of movement, back to front, side to side, rotating, the more restriction there is, the less the muscle fibers can move, and the more they become stuck, and that also can in turn stop joints moving, and it's a vicious cycle that then causes restriction in the muscles around the attachments, the tendons, and that causes inflammation. So inflammation is caused very often from lack of mobility and repetitive movements that are not ideally the way the body would need to move for it to feel for everything to move correctly and balance out the weight ultimately coming down through the muscles, because if one area isn't working correctly, another area is going to have to compensate for that, and we'll look at that in another lesson.